There was a loud chomping sound in the cave. It was the sound of a large orc greedily munching on a piece of meat. And next to the predator was someone's carcass, which it had already stripped of its skin. I was in the middle of a gruesome still life, and next to it was a mountain of old remains. Woo Jin Kim cautiously watched the monster from ambush. He held his bow with a bloody arrow on the bowstring, and reasoned that the dungeon boss is always stronger than all the other monsters in this location, and it would be foolish to engage him without any preparation. But you could try to pierce his body with an arrow with poisoned blood on the tip. Then the player gave a glance command to his skeleton acolyte, and the latter stepped forward with sword in hand. The dungeon boss turned over his shoulder. His eyes glowed even brighter, and he growled loudly and lunged at his new adversary. The skeleton did likewise, and brought his weapon over his head on the run to deliver a powerful blow. Then the living and dead orcs clashed, and the red-eyed foe grinned, and then snapped its predatory curved fangs into the skeleton's collarbone, causing the cave to crackle with the sound of a broken bone. While the skeletons were fighting, Woo Jin Kim stepped out into the open and took aim. At the same time, the guy thought that by the burning blood-red eyes, it was clear that it was the orc hunter who was in front of him now. But he had to avoid his overly tough skin, so he only had to aim for the one weak spot. With that thought, the player unleashed an arrow from his bowstring, and the projectile glowed blue in flight and stabbed the orc hunter right in his bloodshot eye. The orc hunter was thrown back by the force of the blow. He ran his feet over the rocky ground of the cave and piled up a mountain of rubble, and then collapsed on one knee. Then the monster grabbed the arrow by the shaft and yanked it out, then threw it to the floor of the cave. Then the monster roared angrily and breathed a cloud of steam into the air, and blood gushed from its eye. Meanwhile, Woo Jin Kim saw the message that the poisonous blood had affected the orc, took the bow aside, and noted the fact that the weaker the point of impact, the faster the poison spreads through the body. Next, foam spurted from the monster's mouth, causing the player who had wounded it to smile contentedly. And then another message appeared, saying that thanks to the skill of poisonous blood, the orc's health will gradually decrease. Meanwhile, the dungeon boss stared at the young necromancer in bewilderment, with a healthy eye, and collapsed already on both knees, after which he shook his head and put his palm around it. And the player noted the fact that the second level of skill hemotoxin will not increase the chance of death, but now he is quite enough, and the action that is already there. Then the skeleton servant swung his weapon over the orc hunter and struck his opponent, causing his blade to stain with blood, and the undead creator muttered contentedly that now the task was finally done. After a couple of seconds, the guy received a notification that informed him that the orc hunter was now destroyed. The dungeon was cleared. The player's level was raised, and in 1 hour he would be able to leave this location. Because the return shipment had to wait another hour, Woo Jin Kim decided to approach the pile of remains that stood next to the body of the main boss of the entire location, and noted the fact that the monster was in all likelihood gobbling up anyone who was careless enough to get in its way. The brunette then kicked one of the skulls with his foot and wondered if the mishmash of bones contained the ashes of a member of the player group named Yongwon Park. The jolt dislodged the pile of bones with a low thud. The necromancer leaned over it just in case to take a closer look at the remains, and he stumbled upon a long, even trail of blows on the ribs of one of the skeletons with a cutting weapon. Then the boy ran his hand along the trail and concluded that such an injury was definitely not caused by an orc. Then the brunette knelt down in front of the pile of remains and began to rummage through it. At the same time, he began to speculate that, judging by the appearance of the injury, the fighter whose bones he found had been attacked from behind, and it was done by someone who was already used to killing in the dungeons. It was unknown whether the killing had been intentional or not, but if it was committed by a member of the Phoenix Guild of the player group named Yongwon Park, then someone might indeed have gone for such an act because of money and items. After a couple of minutes, Woo Jin Kim exhaled a cloud of steam into the air and began to reflect on the fact that he doesn't have much time left in this dungeon. And yet he doesn't understand how to find traces of the killer. Meanwhile, the wind rose in the location and dispersed the thick clouds behind which the full moon had been hiding up to that moment. Because of its bright light, something glittered far away from where the necromancer was, and quite visibly. This made the boy curious as to whether the strange glow would help him get closer to the player named Yongwon Park. The suspicious light grew stronger, causing the mage to cover his eyes with his palm and move in the direction from which it came. Then the brunette saw a cave that until recently he had not known existed. The tunnel was small, so only one person could get into it, which Woo Jin Kim did. In a small stone nook, he found another skeleton in armor, and with a long sword in his hands. The weapon was surprisingly clean, and the remains themselves were not as badly damaged as the others. Several deep notches could be seen on the wall beside the body, indicating that while this gambler's comrades were fighting the orcs, he escaped and counted his days in this cave, until he ceased to exist. Woo Jin Kim then noticed the phoenix brooch on the dead man's cloak and grinned incredulously at his own observation that such an act was indeed worthy of a member of the guild that had chosen that bird as its own emblem, especially if it was a rising star of the player group named Yongwon Park, as indicated by the initials Jean-I-G on the decoration. The necromancer thought that there was no place in the world more suitable for the last resting place of such a man than here. But he was distracted from thinking about this circumstance by a soft rustling with which a small book fell out of the skeleton's hands. The player was interested in the find, took it in his hands and began to leaf through it, and then was forced to come to the not too comforting conclusion that he found an ordinary diary, and it is hardly possible to find anything interesting. But then the dark-haired man squinted intently as he saw the blacklist of a group of players named Yongwon Park on the pages of the book, and then he closed the diary with a loud clap and smiled contentedly, as he was unusually lucky to stumble upon such a find. A status window appeared before the player's eyes, telling him that a representative of the dark world congratulated him on his dazzling achievement and sent him a legendary skill page as a gift. Woo Jin Kim grinned rather grimly at this unexpected news, because he didn't expect to get such a useful thing here. Then he took the gold-lighted page in his hands and began to read the information that was written on it. As it turned out, the necromancer had managed to obtain the rare Eye of Anubis ability, which allowed him to see into the past of the dead. Then the necromancer smiled even wider, and his eyes lit up in the glow of the page. And the gambler thought to himself that having such an opportunity in his current situation would be incredibly useful, and that, whatever failures had haunted him in his past life, things were different now. The mage then tore open the page, and a blue light flashed before him about who was talking about obtaining the skill Eye of Anubis, as well as obtaining the legendary heir achievement. Woo Jin Kim stepped closer to the Skeleton Phoenix Guild member and knelt down in front of him, only to then wrap his palms around the unlucky player's skull and smile at his own thoughts that often the dead cannot speak, but that didn't matter to him now. As he did so, his eyes lit up with blue fire, and then black flashes of smoke, like light littered them. Then smoke came from the necromancer's eyes. This was due to the fact that the player had activated the skill Eye of Anubis. Next, a blinding beam of light flashed between the sorcerer's eyes and the skeleton's empty sockets, causing the cave to burst into flames, and the servant skeleton looked around in an attempt to understand exactly what had happened. Meanwhile, Woo Jin Kim began to see images that, until recently, were not in his mind and could not be. First, he heard about the bloody orcs, and then some player with a bloody face called out to Yong Gai for help and reached out to him, but the latter, instead of helping, cursed and ran in the opposite direction. Next, the fugitive saw a small cave and hid in it. after which he wrapped his arms around his head and began wailing that he must not die. Then another voice was heard, saying, fearfully, that it was a crime to hunt people. But Yongju paid absolutely no attention to such an argument. Instead, he calmly strode across the puddles of blood on the stone floor and smiled, then explained that he was in absolutely no danger as long as he had an imposing patron behind him. His unknown companion only managed to round his eyes in a frightened way and guess exactly who the guy with the scars on his face was talking about. He held his sword over him, smiled even wider, and then began to tell him who would one day own the Phoenix Guild. The last conscious image the necromancer was able to see was of a man in a chair. Given the memories of the dead man whose past the boy had been able to see, this player's name was Yongwon Park. Then flashes of black smoke reached back to the wizard's eyes, and the bright stream of light that connected them and the skeleton's empty eye sockets exploded. After the Eye of Anubis ability ended, Woo Jin Kim dropped the skull of the hapless fighter from his hands, which was the last time he told anyone his story. And then with one palm he leaned rather heavily on the ground, and with the other he put his hand around his own face and grinned painfully. Then the boy began to consider the memories of the dead man he had seen, and was forced to conclude that the latter had a very painful past, but he himself had expended far more magical power than he would have liked. After that, the gambler smiled wearily and noted the fact that his training was now complete. And if he used this information, as well as the blacklist that he had recently managed to find, he would be able to get close to a player named Yongwon Park. And it doesn't really matter how careful that person might be. Meanwhile, in the cozy and bright cottage, events of a somewhat different nature were taking place. It was not that fighting over bloody fists was a rare occurrence in these walls. Not at all. But the man who now lay on the office floor would have preferred not to face it, especially on his own skin. When the undesirable employee was asked why he allowed another player to take over the dungeon, he raised his blood-stained face and began to ask loudly for forgiveness, then rather hastily added that he would take care of him, just in case. To this, the head of the office irritatedly asked what exactly his subordinate was going to do. After all, the dungeon he couldn't handle had been cleaned out by some rookie, and after that, the employee still dares to say something like that. The chief then clarified whether or not he had been heard, and then turned to his secretary by the name of Kim. The blonde girl responded by humbly bowing her head, apologizing, and saying that she would start the task right away, while the boss continued to carefully read some newspaper. At the same time, an employee who had failed in his task was picked up and dragged away by two gloomy men dressed in business suits. Their hapless ward immediately began shouting that they should wait and not take his life, and then started begging for a second chance. But then all his cries were interrupted by the loud banging of a closed door. After that, the chief began to nonchalantly speculate that a rookie who had cleared the dungeon alone was definitely interesting, though there was nothing surprising in his actions. Next, the man asked his secretary if it was true that this player had a bad reputation in his own guild. The girl confirmed this information and began to tell about the fact that in the first dungeon, this guy had abandoned his partners. She also voiced rumors that he had appropriated all the rewards in the process, although it was impossible to verify this information. The chief mumbled thoughtfully in response that, true or not, if the guy's reputation in the Phoenix Guild was really bad, it would be hard enough to move on, because it was always impossible to clean up the dungeons alone. But then the chief's musings were interrupted by a phone call. As it turned out, a man named Woo Jin Kim had requested a meeting with the boss. The man in the white suit smiled at this, and added that the newcomer never ceased to amaze him, since he himself had come to the lion's den. After that, Yongwon Park put aside the newspaper he had been reading until recently, and picked up the report on the applications for the AA Aegis-ranked Dungeon Suite. Based on the information it provided, 20 places had been allocated to the Phoenix Guild, although their number was evenly distributed this time. Meanwhile, The Phoenix Guild office was not too quiet either. The secretary was just making a report on the fact that 3 guilds, including a player guild named Yangwon Park, were vying for the remaining 20 spots in the AI-ranked dungeon. The biggest problem, however, was that even if they allocated 6 seats to each faction, there would still be 2 seats left to fight over. Because of this information, the chief sighed that such a fact greatly complicates the current state of affairs, with which the employee had to agree. And then he added that it was for this reason that the guilds had not yet been able to come to any compromise. Then the man adjusted his glasses and continued his report with the information that because of the rank of this dungeon, the chance of finding rare items in it is greatly increased. And since it has only 1 level, the efficiency of clearing it is also quite high. The warden listened to his subordinate and clasped his hands together, then began to reason rather tiredly that the guilds would probably not concede to each other, because all of their members were simply overwhelmed with self-confidence, though many of them don't even realize what can happen in the dungeon. And then the bearded man loosened his tie altogether, and added that all these players already reminded him of a pain in the ass. Next, the gray-haired man rubbed his forehead tiredly, and asked if there was anyone who was not a member of one guild or another, but had applied for the remaining 2 seats. The answer to this question was no, to which the chief stared at the ceiling and muttered thoughtfully that it was understandable. After all, there's no telling what might happen to you if you enter a dungeon without a group. The phone call interrupted the boss's not-so-happy musings. As it turned out, Mr. Yangwon Park was on the other end of the unseen line, waiting to talk. The manager raised his eyebrows in surprise at the news, as the situation with the new location was already complicated. At the same time, the bearded man picked up the phone and said that he was listening, but then he dazedly interrogated something, and then practically shouted the name of the new member of the Phoenix Guild, from whom, as it turned out, too much trouble had been coming lately. After that, the older man began furiously questioning exactly what it was all about. The office worker angrily questioned whether the conversation was really about an overzealous rookie, and even blushed with anger. But then his emotions faded into the background, for his boss had just finished the phone conversation, and added that he would get back to him later. The manager immediately asked what happened and got the tired answer that Woo Jin Kim wanted to take the remaining 2 spots without the knowledge of the other guild members. And the warden went on to elaborate on his own idea that if it really is about the newcomer, then the rumors about him really aren't true. And since he always goes alone, the other groups won't be too worried. The subordinate responded by asking if the guy had now become a member of a group of players named Yangwon Park. However, he could not get an exact answer from the boss, because the competitors could easily use the player to sweep the dungeon, and then get rid of him. The secretary then adjusted his glasses and clarified what would happen to the remaining 1 spot, and whether other factions would fight for it. However, the boss replied that Yangwon Park would agree to cede it to the other factions if the Phoenix Guild provided him with a newcomer for that raid, so they would simply mediate between the 2 remaining guilds. The man went on to argue that their competitor was an amazing strategist, and the fact that Woo Jin Kim was an ace up his sleeve was very surprising. However, sometimes it is better to back down to reap the greatest rewards later. But there was only one question, and that was exactly how the newcomer had met their rival. Meanwhile, Kim's secretary asked his superior why he had decided to accept the application of a player named Woo Jin Kim. The man with the scarred face first snickered questioningly, then pointed to his guild's blacklist book and explained that he'd had fun watching the guy make his way over here to bring such a thing, and it just so happened that there weren't a lot of good guys left. Besides, the boss was confident that he could manipulate the new guy and then get rid of him at any moment, and it would happen the second the young player stopped being useful. An hour ago, a conversation of a different nature was taking place within the walls of this office. Yangwon Park picked up the diary with the black list of his guild members and asked if his interlocutor knew what it was all about. Woo Jin Kim answered in the affirmative, and then added that he had already looked at the contents of the shabby book. After that, the office manager asked why the guy had come to him in the first place, and whether he was going to blackmail him and get money too. The man then smiled predatorily and asked if the guest was sure that blackmail would work on a player named Youngwon Park, especially with such a thing that the newcomer himself had brought into his office. At the same second, two rather imposing-looking guards hovered over the guest. However, the brunette did not pay much attention to such a frank demonstration of his own abilities, and instead told the owner of the office that he came here with a proposal, not blackmail, and then began to tell him that now everyone is talking about the AK Ranked 1 story, Dungeon, and that he himself would like to get into it. Youngwon Park was visibly surprised by such an answer and even asked what his visitor meant at first. Then the man gave a loud snort and then laughed out loud and added that Woo Jin Kim was really funny. And then he stared at him with a prickly squint and asked if the visitor understood what kind of dungeon it was to say such things to him. He scratched the back of his head and nonchalantly replied that he knew what he was talking about. "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, because the Phoenix and Messiah guilds are competing for this location, because it has a limited number of seats." The man with the scar on his face was surprised by this remark, because the man, who knows this information, expressed his desire to go to this place, despite the possible risks to his own person. Then Youngwon Park loudly slammed the diary Woo Jin Kim had brought him onto the table beside him and added that his guest appeared to be a real lunatic. Next, the head of the office grinned bloodily and agreed to the visitor's offer. However, at the same time has a counter-condition to him, which must be fulfilled. The building of Gangbu University was illuminated by bright sunlight, but in one of its many classrooms, a lecture was taking place at the same moment. The lecturer went on to say that everyone present in the room now must be aware of the contents of the dungeon report. However, there are at least 1,000 orcs in this location. However, their number could be an order of magnitude higher. Woo Jin Kim listened to the speech with a completely calm expression on his face. From the other players, however, he did not sit, but stood at the end of the hall and propped his back against the wall. However, when the information that in past attacks on the location about 70 people survived, and half of the participants did not return from it, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully and began to speculate that only elite players from each guild gathered here. After all, given this fact, it was impossible to say that all the casualties arose only by fighting monsters. Next, the boy continued to watch the lecturer with an attentive squint and thought about the fact that he had previously had to turn a blind eye to such statistics for lack of evidence. However, the chance that the struggle was not just with monsters, but also among players. After all, it was a good opportunity to get rid of opponents and steal valuable items. Then the brunette in his usual hoodie moved to leave the auditorium, and at the same time began to reason already about the fact that in this dungeon there was a reward for killing an orc warrior. That is, the boss of the location, the Fang of the Orc genus. Eventually, the prize was given to the Messiah Guild for its enormous contribution to this sweep. In the past, Woo Jin Kim knew nothing. But when he thought about it now, he realized that it was very strange. It was quite possible that Si-Jun Lee had already been involved in corruption at that time. After a few seconds, the boy left the lecture hall and walked down the bright corridor. At the same time, he was thinking about the fact that even if the head of the Messiah Guild was behind this incident, that the commercial organization itself had nothing to do with it, and that instead of directly influencing it, it had infiltrated spies in other guilds, and that now he needed to predict their next move based on his own memories from his past life. A huge portal to another reality glowed brightly with blue flames. A rather large crowd of players gathered in front of the location, and then all of them were ordered to enter the dungeon. At the same time, representatives of the Messiah, Phoenix, Lion, and Skull guilds had significant differences in appearance, as each participant wore a uniform, the color and cut of which depended directly on the affiliation to one or another organization. Woo Jin Kim on the other hand, stood out noticeably in his casual clothes. Though he wasn't bothered by that fact. He walked toward the portal too, and adjusted his hood as he went. And at the same time, he thought that he would prefer to rip the orcish fang right out of the hands of his former leader. A bright blue flash of transition illuminated the forest, which was located in the dungeon. A warrior in heavy armor and a sorceress with a staff in her hands began to speculate about where the members of their guild were now, because with all those people around it was almost impossible to find them. However, they were interrupted by the head of the Messiah Guild unit. The player gave the order to line up, and his subordinates fairly quickly emerged from the crowd. The other members of the sweep had never seen anything like this before. Some looked at the picture with disapproval, some with surprise, and some did not hide their own delight and began to say that such a thing could be expected from the Messiah. That such a result was fantastic, and that the guild was praised for a reason. Such talk was rather quickly interrupted by the players, who appeared rather skeptical. After all, the fact that someone was the first to speak did not mean anything in this location, since the entire area was swarming with thousands of orcs. As if in confirmation of these words, the first orc appeared in the clearing near the portal and roared furiously, as he saw the strangers in his territory. From among the fighters in light armor, one stepped forward and declared that the Messiah would deal with the unexpected enemy, and let the others watch it carefully. Then the player activated the skill Vivacious Fighter, and it ended in a successful provocation. Next, the fighter gave a bellicose cry and slammed his shield to the ground, causing a wave of dust to rise, and an expression of malicious surprise on the face of the orc. Then the orc rushed to the warrior, and with all his inhuman strength, hit him on the shield with his fist, and then tried to throw the player aside, causing more dust and rubble in the air. The orc roared in frustration over his own failed attempt, while his opponent snidely clarified whether that was all he was capable of. In the next second, the sorceress joined the fight, her eyes and palms glowing with golden fire. The girl used the skill Lord of the Source of Wisdom. Moreover, she managed to restrain the orc, which was firmly entangled by numerous fetters that burst from somewhere under the ground. Then the glow around the sorceress intensified, and the dark green ropes reached the monster's neck and began to choke it, causing the orc to clutch at them with his hands to relieve the dangerous pressure. Then he wheezed and bared his huge fangs, which spurted out in thick foam. But further into the forest that densely covered the entire dungeon, there was a loud noise, and the ground beneath the player's feet shuddered sensibly. The less experienced members of the sweep began frightenedly asking what it was, and shouting about an earthquake. However, their more experienced colleagues countered that in all likelihood the cause of the sound and vibration was somewhere behind the forest. They prepared their weapons and waited tensely for who knows what. And then other orcs poured into the clearing they were in. A battle ensued, the air filled with the stomping of monsters, screams, snarls, and clinking of weapons, and blood poured to the ground, tearing off the sharp blades with every blow. Next, the battle was joined by mages whose hands burst into flames of gold, visible even in spite of the clouds of dust that rose into the air. After that, a cry resounded through the ranks of the Messiah Guild warriors that the time had come, and it was time to move forward. The warriors followed it and rushed at the orcs. Meanwhile, on a branch of an old tree that grew nearby, Woo Jin Kim was nestled. He watched the players battle with the monsters, and concluded that, just as he thought, no one had noticed his absence. Next, the boy smiled contentedly, for now it was time for his turn. Woo Jin Kim stood on a tall tree branch and watched the battle between the four most famous guilds and the orcs, and came to the conclusion that the enemies would not be able to push the players back to that extent. Then the lad pushed off the branch on which he had previously settled and jumped to the next, for in this way he could avoid moving on the ground, and, as a result, unnecessary meetings with the inhabitants of this dungeon. and in the process, he began to reason that he should take advantage of the situation and locate the warrior orc. Under the terms of the dungeon cleansing, it was necessary to get rid of the warrior orc and thousands of his subordinates. Guild representatives will first try to reduce the number of rank-and-file opponents to reduce their own losses. However, after the elimination of 1,000 orcs, the players will begin to look for the boss of this location, and until that moment, he must have time to get the warrior orc Fang. With this thought, the necromancer continued his movement between branches, and smiled in anticipation of the future venture. The high peaks of sharp rocks stretched toward the full moon from somewhere behind the forest. Among these stone claws was the camp of the orcs, and the shelter of their leader. The orc warlord sat on his throne, presiding over the trial of one of his subjects, who had been defeated in a skirmish with the gamblers who had come to cleanse him. The monster was now on its knees, awaiting its fate, arrows protruding from its body, blood streaming down its chin. Then the other orc roared and swung his stone sword, causing blood to gush onto the stone floor and the hapless fellow to fall breathless. The rest of the monsters roared and stared at their leader with eyes that lit up with fierce fire. He, in turn, gripped the armrest with his fingers, then stood up and raised his axe above his head, before roaring loudly. A huge number of monstrous enemies moved away under the orders of their ruler, and Woo Jin Kim, who was watching the whole scene from one of the cliffs above the enemy camp, concluded that following the orc who had escaped from the battlefield was a good idea. Then the guy watched directly for the boss of the location that he and the other players had to clean up. He looked stronger than the necromancer had imagined, but he had sent his minions to fight the guild members, so luck was on the brunette's side now. Next, the orc warrior returned to his seat and climbed onto his stone throne, causing clouds of dust to rise into the air. And the necromancer smiled predatorily and thought that while the others were fighting on the front lines, he could get close to the main enemy while he was alone and strike first. Meanwhile, the battle in the clearing, where the players had reached immediately after the transition between realities, was over. The commander of the Messiah Guild looked at the mountains of green-skinned bodies, leaned on his sword, and declared that the orcs were not so difficult to fight, and that it was time to move on. This decision was due to the fact that there were fewer opponents than he had expected, and, in all likelihood, their main forces are in another place. Then, however, the warrior was interrupted. A scout came to him with a report that many new orcs were heading toward the players. The warrior inquired about the number of enemies, to which he received the answer of about 1,000 enemies, and by all appearances, that was their main force. Next, the commander turned to the other players who were in the clearing, including those who belonged to other guilds, and began to tell them that, as he thought, they should all stop at today's achievements. After all, it would take a lot more equipment to go up against the main force of the orcish army. But then the man was interrupted by the angry cries of those who disagreed with such arguments and declared that the representatives of the Messiah Guild were nobody and had no right to order them around. As it turned out, the Lion Guild members opposed the arrangement proposed by the fighter in the light cuirass. They confidently declared that they were not Messiah's dogs and intended to continue the offensive. The Messiah squad leader gave the daredevils a disapproving look and proceeded to explain his advice by stating that many orcs were headed their way, and while competition between the guilds was important, without harmonious work, they would all perish in this dungeon. However, the commander of the Lion Squad ecily clarified why their competitors are so unsure of their own strength. After all, if they were so afraid of ordinary orcs, then they in principle should not have entered this location. Then the golden armored warriors moved forward, while the Messiah warriors stayed in the same place and looked at them for a while. After which the scout said that these players were real self-righteous idiots, and the squad leader instead offered to find a safe place to rest and prepare for the next battle. Woo Jin Kim cried incredulously that this could not be, and a look of great surprise appeared on his face. Meanwhile, the orc chief once again prepared to attack. However, the second skeleton roared angrily, and his eyes lit up like ball lightning. Then the dungeon boss struck again with his weapon, sending a column of pebbles and dust flying into the air. But he couldn't hit it, and the servants started running around the orc, which made the orc even angrier. However, the dark-haired mage who brought the undead back from oblivion understood that the skeleton warrior would not last long, and his only chance was to attack now, while the last skeleton distracted the orc chief. With that thought, the boy raised his bow and took aim, then released a poisoned arrow from the bowstring, and it flew toward the enemy, who at that moment was just trying to hit the overly dexterous servant of the necromancer with an axe. Except that things did not go at all the way the young player had planned. Instead of becoming an easy target, the orc leader turned around and managed to dodge the projectile at the last moment, first bewildering the necromancer, and then realizing that he had underestimated the enemy's strength. Meanwhile, the skeleton tried to use the tactic of chopping the legs of an opponent who was many times his size. However, after another such strike, the servant's sword simply broke, unpleasantly surprising the dark-haired wizard. The next second, the main enemy dropped his axe on the skeleton, causing the undead to literally crumble and scatter in all directions in small shards of bone. After that, huge orc stared burning with anger at player, who could only take his bow, and then he caught himself at the thought that it would be difficult to get out of the situation in which he was now, and most likely a change of plan would be necessary. The orc warrior stood beside his throne, and the magical fang-shaped necklace still hung around his uncircumcised neck. Wu Jin Kim had to point out the fact that it was useless to fight the boss while such a powerful artifact was in his possession, especially since his level of magical power was not enough for a full-fledged fight with the enemy. So this time, the player chose to prudently retreat, while noting that the orc warrior was not pursuing him for some reason. Meanwhile, the monster didn't even turn its head in his direction, and the necromancer surmised that it probably seemed too troublesome for him to pursue a retreating enemy. Though that was to be expected for an AI-rank dungeon boss. The boy smiled, for the circumstance played into his hands and gave him the opportunity to hide freely. But when he returned, the monster would regret having let his adversary go so easily. Then Wu Jin Kim climbed up the tree again and began to move rather quickly through the branches of the area, which was overgrown with forest. His silhouette was noticed by the other players, and they began to discuss who exactly they had just seen. As it turned out, they were members of the Lion Guild, and the head of their squad bellowed angrily that it turns out they weren't the only ones who left the battlefield. Then the other warriors joined in the conversation. They suggested that perhaps this member of the mopping up found the orc warrior faster than they had managed. However, the commander began to explain to his subordinates that this theory may or may not have been correct. After all, no one knows for sure if he is going back because he found the warrior orc. And then he added that they should not blindly believe anyone until they have seen the main adversary with their own eyes. After that, the red-haired man began to reason that the item that falls from the dungeon boss of rank A should belong to the Lion Guild no matter what. But then his emotional speech was interrupted by a sound that caused the commander and his chief aide to look around. Then, one by one, the men fell to the ground, and pools of viscous blood swarmed around their bodies. The commander's face froze with horror, and then he started screaming, trying to understand what was going on. Then the man gripped his sword more comfortably and rambled on about how he'd heard nothing about any other monsters than orcs in this location. And he added that they couldn't possibly be monsters at all. But, as if to refute his words, the darkness between the trees flashed with the twin lights of someone's eyes. Then the gambler screamed frantically for his adversary to show himself, and whether he expected to be safe after all he had just done. But the red-haired fighter's desperate cry was interrupted by a thunderous growl. Meanwhile, in another part of the dungeon, in one of the many caves, a fire was burning. Woo Jin Kim headed towards its light and saw other players inside, huddled around the fire. The lad saw the other members of the sweep and was relieved to think that there were no guilds here that might be interested in his person. But then he noticed the gloomy faces and stiff postures, and noted that from the atmosphere in the cave, it looked as if he were at a funeral. However, after a couple of moments, the brunette stopped and understood the reason for the gloomy mood of the other players, as he saw many fresh graves and thought about how many people had ceased to exist on the first day of the raid. Next, the necromancer began to observe the other players, and thought that something was clearly wrong. Even though there were only soldiers gathered here, they were all well prepared, and most likely the battle between the guilds had already begun, just as he suspected. Meanwhile, the players who were sitting around the fire began to talk among themselves. There was talk about how some of them looked awful and had apparently overdone it, despite their own abilities. However, the observation that the same could be said of all who were present followed in response. However, the Heishi Guild representative was indignant over this wording, because he was sure that their organization was the most alive. Then he asked if there was any news about the members of the other organizations. Next, a blonde warrior entered the conversation and began to tell what he heard, as if the greatest losses suffered by the Lion Guild. Their group went into the woods to retrieve items, but disappeared. He was interrupted by a dark-skinned warrior who protested that not one group was missing, or even two. And then he asked if it was possible at all. The answer was yes, because the bodies of the players were so badly damaged that they could no longer be recognized. And in general, orcs make a living out of eating people. Meanwhile, someone mumbled about how awful it was, and even if he ceased to exist, he would not want to become food for monsters. However, the pessimist was immediately interrupted, because if you talk about such a subject, it could become a reality. Next, the players stared into the fire and began to speculate that what bothered them all was how strange things were. After all, if this had been a normal mission, there would have been far fewer casualties. No one could disagree with that fact. So they talked about the fact that maybe at least someone would survive this sweep. After all, human life should be placed above objects and the like. Woo Jin Kim sat a little aside from the other players, listening to their conversations and thinking that, given being in an 8-ranked dungeon, such a development was quite possible. However, the chances of so many groups being wiped out in one day are not that high, so there is definitely something behind so many missing participants, and his plan could fail if the soldiers became weaker. And then the necromancer decided that starting tomorrow he would work harder to solve this problem. The bright morning sun was rising over the dense forest. At first one could not suspect that the forest was in fact teeming with hordes of orcs, whose roar caused flocks of birds to fly frightened into the area. The monsters were all moving in the same direction, and that made the players, whom they were getting close to, nervous with anger and fear. But the panic was quickly suppressed by the commanders, who reminded their less experienced subordinates to keep quiet and concentrate on the battle. A wave of green-skinned men moved toward the players' squad, and then the monsters roared viciously to intimidate their human opponents. After which a battle ensued, and the battlefield was covered with the dust that was raised by thousands of pairs of feet. Woo Jin Kim stepped away from looking at his inventory window and turned around to look at the flock of birds that had flown away fearfully because of the noise that had risen in the dungeon because of the battle, and noted that the main battle with the main orc force seemed to have already begun. Next, the boy went back to his work and at the same time thought that his problem at the moment was the impossibility of striking the warrior orc as effectively as possible with the items he now had in his possession. Then player remembered how the skeleton servant he had summoned broke his sword after hitting the dungeon boss, and then he himself crumbled into tiny crumbs under the monster's huge axe. This circumstance made the use of the undead as bait unsuccessful because they were too weakly resistant to physical damage. But after that, the necromancer wondered if the skeleton warriors could shoot an arrow. And to find out the answer, the dark-haired mage began to summon a new acolyte. The orc warrior sat on his stone throne, holding a huge axe of sharply honed stone in his hand. And then Woo Jin Kim, armed with a long sword, appeared in his field of vision. He noted that the monster seemed perfectly calm today and inquired about the start of the second round of their confrontation, to which the location boss growled angrily and activated the fang that hung around his neck in the form of a pendant. Next, the artifact flashed bright blue fire, and its owner jumped on the player, sending a wall of dust and small stones into the air. Seconds later, however, the monster roared as blue lightning whizzed past it, and then shielded itself with an axe from the arrow someone had fired at it. Then someone else attacked again, and the orc warrior looked around with eyes glowing with rage at the area he was on. It appeared that two skeletal servants, armed with bows, were firing at him. Then the monster swung his axe and ripped a large stone from the ground, which immediately flew into the wall above the heads of the skeletons, causing the bone fighters hurriedly run to the side and on the move shot again at the orc. He repelled both blows with his axe again, while Woo Jin Kim jumped over his opponent's head and noted the fact that, just as he thought, skeleton warriors also knew how to shoot an arrow. So it was definitely going according to plan, which made the guy smile predatorily. Woo Jin Kim swung his sword and tumbled in flight, then darted past the warrior orc, startling the monster and cutting the lace of the necklace that was hanging around his neck. Next, the monster turned its head toward the insolent player, and the pendant slipped from its place, and the necromancer simply caught it in flight, causing him to immediately see a status window, which informed the guy about receiving the Orcish Lord's fang, and the space around it lit up with sapphire fire. Meanwhile, the loss of the artifact weakened the orc warrior, and his strength and defense diminished. The monster roared and struck with an axe in front of him. But Woo Jin Kim managed to dodge the attack, but the beast itself had no time to do this, and a second later, two poisoned arrows stuck in his knee, which caused the hemotoxin to enter the body of the enemy, and immediately began to take effect. The dungeon boss turned around and saw that the skeleton warriors had managed to hit him after all, and the creator smiled, for the warrior orc's fang was now in his hands, and his attacks against the green-skinned man were now more successful. Next, the player looked closely at the artifact in his hands and opened the status window, which reported that during use, the Orcish Lord's fang increased stamina by 30 units, and increased attack and physical defense strength by 5% of the total. After that, the necromancer got the Lord Orcish Fang Holder achievement, and activated the item, causing everything around him to burst into a blue glow, and he thought to himself that now there was only one thing he had to do, and that was to get a weapon that could take the dungeon boss's head off. To do that, the brunette cut his palm and smeared blood on the blade of his sword. Meanwhile, the skeleton servants again fired at the green-skinned leader, and he let out a loud roar and at the same time began to deflect more shots of bone warriors. However, one of the throwing projectiles still hit the monster between the ribs, and caused him to get more blood poisoning. At the same time, Woo Jin Kim rushed out of his seat, and where he had been standing a moment before. A blow from an orcish axe came crashing down, and the necromancer somersaulted again, in flight, and thrust his sword into the monster's body, inflicting further hemotoxin poisoning. The orc roared angrily and dropped his axe, which made his opponent smile. The weapon fell to the ground beside the skeleton servant, and the undead's eyes immediately flashed with predatory fire. And then the bony fighter dropped his bow and picked up the heavy axe, then lunged at the main monster of the location. And his maker thought it would be the perfect weapon to decapitate the boss. The desperate roar of the main enemy was heard by the scout. He began to look around for the source of the strange sound, because it was not a scream that ordinary orcs make. Then the blonde-haired player raced toward the sound, thinking that perhaps someone nearby was fighting a warrior orc. In such a situation, it was necessary to immediately figure out who this guy was and report to the guild as quickly as possible. So the scout accelerated, and after a few jumps along the branches of the huge trees, he found himself at the edge of the stone plateau. There he saw 2 skeleton warriors and 1 gambler who had already almost dealt with the main boss of dungeon, but he could not feel the presence of anyone else. And this fact indicated that the strange man is fighting against the orc champion alone. Such a scenario was almost impossible, so the scout decided to immediately report what he had seen, the guild command, and hastily rushed away, causing a mocking smile of the necromancer, who noticed him. However, just as the blonde-haired gambler jumped up to climb a nearby tree, his little flight was interrupted by an arrow that pierced the unlucky fugitive's shoulder. Next, the scout collapsed on the ground and looked around, trying to figure out exactly who had attacked him. Then he remembered the picture on the rocky wasteland and thought that someone must have seen him. And it was probably an asshole who didn't want him to blab about how someone had killed an orc warrior. But then the boy saw some movement behind him and turned around. And then he saw the figure of some fighter, whose clothes were glowing with a ghostly light. From the mask on his face, the scout could tell that a Skull Guild fighter stood before him. But a second later, his existence was terminated by a sneaky sword blow to the back, and viscous blood poured from the wound to the ground. Guys, please like and subscribe to my channel if you like Manhwa and everything related to it. I would also be very pleased if you could write a comment. Thank you.